Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and I'm so delighted today to be joined by the always wonderful Billy Crudup to talk all about Apple TV Plus's The Morning Show. And obviously, in making the second season, the beauty of any character that you get to carry for this long is that the beginning of the process is really about building the foundational elements, building the backstory, and figuring out who they are. And then in this season, there's so many great opportunities to see, well, who is Cory as a character when he gets everything that he's wanted? You know, what's kind of the devil's deal that he's made that he didn't even know he was making at the time, and how does he respond to all these situations now that instead of rallying against the system, he is part of the system. So I was interested in how, as a performer, that really allows you to take a character that you spent so much time building up those foundational elements of, and then almost distilling down to like the different responses as you look through the scripts and as you find these different external circumstances in figuring out how he's going to respond to each of them.
That's a phenomenal question, and a perfect question for Cory too, because he's so elusive in the first season. And part of the excitement playing the part was trying to uncover what were somewhat unknowable motivations, and the way in which he interacted with the fellow members of his company and the other characters that occupy the morning show was not like the way that other characters related to one another. So there was a great deal of sleuthing going around. Carrie Aaron had all the answers because she's the one who created him. So it was a slowly evolving and exciting journey to find somebody who was so difficult to understand, but so interesting to try to follow because he had such a facile mind and seemed to be curious about the world that he was inhabiting. So to then move to the second season where he's got a vested interest in the things that maybe he didn't seem quite tied to before. There's an aspect of it that like takes his superpowers away. And Carrie and I talked about that quite a lot. She was describing him somewhat as like Pinocchio, as he becomes a real boy. And there is both an agony in relinquishing the mystery of him and a thrill at creating a person with more dimensions than I had sort of anticipated, or more dimensions that would be of interest to the show. So that aspect of it in the second season was I've never done a TV show for 2 seasons before. And typically when you get a script, you have an idea of what part of the story your character occupies. So you can take them from the beginning to the end. So to be in the midst of something that you feel in control of and excited about for specific reasons and have it upended in that way was really a great creative challenge. And I loved it.
And with that idea of the different dimensions as well, you know, with any two people in any situation or any characters, there's always different versions of the truth. And with Cory in particular, that feels so extensively true because there's the truth as it presents itself in the world, and then there's the truth that Cory consistently tells himself, which is often very different. But what was great is that in this season, we got the chance to see what happens when those two worlds collide, you know, especially when he hands over the news story about Bradley, you know, and he feels like he's doing the right thing in preservation of Hannah's memory. But at the same time, he then ultimately has to face these two truths colliding. And so I was interested in how you kind of always get to play that duality of the truth that he creates for himself, the world that he's able to concoct in his mind, and how he exists within that ecosystem. And then, you know, what it was like to be able to play it coming into the real world a little bit more for him.
It's a great question. That I suppose that's true of all of us in terms of the story that we tell ourselves about who we are in the world and what motivates us and what are the foundations of our moral, spiritual ethics, and how does our behavior reflect those principles. And for Cory, because he seems to be such an agent of capitalism, like purely an agent of capitalism, you can't complain about somebody behaving that way when the system is set up for people like that. So if we live in a country that applauds people who can manage the complexities of business interactions in such a way to become profitable, why aren't they then just totally accepted for their ability to manipulate a system in their own favor, if that's what we're asking. And so Cory, therefore, has a very simple motivation, which is to make money. And the way in which he accumulates wealth and status and power is an expression of his capability at managing those principles. So when something interferes with that, for instance, an emotional connection with someone, him trying to find language for success in an interpersonal relationship was one of the really entertaining things for me in playing Cory this season, because he simply has the language that he has for capitalism is so extensive that people can't follow it. The people that he surrounds himself with are constantly either delighted or baffled by whatever's going on with him, because of his ability to be expressive in that particular motivation. But when it comes to relationships, I think he himself doesn't understand the language that goes into the feelings that are churning within him. And so to see those two things happening at once on the page makes for a very exciting thing to try to make manifest when we're actually shooting it. And I think you don't really see the particulars of it until the final episode, when he tries to articulate what seems to be an elusive feeling within him about another person. And that, when I read that scene, it sort of retroactively informed the entire season for me, which was great, because Carrie was the one who had been organizing and orchestrating it the entire time. And I think she knew very clearly where she was going with it. And so I was grateful to arrive at an end that I could understand as well.
And with that idea that he doesn't have the language to express himself in that way, that tells us that this is something that's an anomaly for him to even have these feelings and try to figure out how to process it. And I was very curious if you think about him as a character who has a lot of loneliness inside of him, and whether that even matters to him. There's that great speech that he gives to Stella in the elevator where he's like, it doesn't matter how I am, and he's such a company man. He's like, the company owns you. That's what he lives and dies for. And especially with UBA becoming more of a global conglomerate, this guy probably hasn't slept in the last year at all either. And so you imagine that he's got very few facets of life outside of his job. And so do you think he's lonely, and do you think it matters to him, because this is a persona that he's been concocting for himself since childhood, where he planned to be in this position?
Well, the phrase that came to mind while you were asking that question was, it's hard to be a romantic capitalist. He is fixated on this journey. In fact, when we first started to discuss what his apartment might look like, because we at the beginning of the season, it wasn't clear whether or not he was going to stay at the hotel or have an apartment for himself. My suggestion was he should have a mattress on the floor and a whole bunch of books, and that's it. He lives a kind of monkish lifestyle. And if he gets 2-3 hours a night, he's good. He exercises, he's focused, he's mentally as acute as any character I think I've ever played, or as acutely realized intellectually as any character I've ever played. And the challenge of being that good at something is that the other features of your life fade away, and you can be not just surprised. That's not quite quite the right word for it, but haunted by simple feelings that most people typically have to manage in their life. They do a number of different things to get through the day. They have friendships, they have family, they have romantic interests, they vote, they think about their community, they have some sort of faith, they're involved with work. All of those disparate things, you do well enough at each of them, and you're a functioning adult. Like, that's a normal way. It's a normal way for most people to encounter the world. Cory has decided to specialize. And I think you'll find this with a lot of people who are highly ambitious and very successful, is it's very difficult for them to maintain all the features of their life. So they allow parts of them to drop away, like friendships, like relationships, maybe their family, maybe their faith, maybe their health. You know, there's a myriad of different things that you can leave by the wayside while you're struggling to perform at an expert level at a very difficult thing. And so for Cory, you get to see in the second season how infantile he is in other aspects of his complexity, his humanity. And the contrast of those two things, this expert ability at one thing and this novice ability at something that is so common for most people, to me, I found it charming. I thought that was a lovely approach to somebody who occupies such a difficult position. Most of us would consider the idea of a CEO of a multinational media company a difficult position. And I think for Cory, that's the easy part. Even the struggles that UBA Plus is having are probably more entertaining than consequential. It's the emotional ties that have now bound him to this company, bound him to the hopes of the success for Bradley and the attempt to preserve Hannah's memory have contorted his ability to do the thing that he knows how to, do while he sleeps. And that's fascinating and fun as an actor and a performer. You pray for these kinds of roles. They don't happen very often. And when they do, you're not the one who gets them. So when you do, it is so exhilarating. And I suppose that's the thing that I take away from both seasons the most, is this opportunity to collaborate with these people and on such an interesting character and try to work at such a high level at a piece of material that is aspiring for so much. It's more than lucky. It's more than good fortune. It's like a once in a lifetime opportunity.
And with the mental acuteness that you were talking about within him, and what you were saying earlier about, the dialogue that he delivers and the things that he says, kind of everybody else runs into a bit of a wall with it because he's so far ahead of them. Is that where you also, in terms of performance in scenes, find a lot of that pace and delivery? Because I know in season 1, you mentioned that the monologues, being pages long, were one of the challenging aspects of this character. And
it was challenging. It was impossible.
Have you found more of an adeptness with it in the season,
or
is it still the same?
No, it's just grinding hard work. I mean, that if I could, the exciting part is on the day to try to make it appear as though those ideas are coming to him in real time, and that my brain is functioning at the level that his brain is. And the way that I go about that is weeks and weeks of grinding, like just from an actor's perspective, one of the ways that you could describe it is text analysis. And you read these speeches over and over and over again and try to map your way through what's happening in his mind. And what you find is that Cory and the team of writers have written a person who thinks in paragraphs. An idea occurs to them that is highly complex and probably prescient in some way that it makes it exciting for him to express it to somebody. And he's able to not only arrive at that idea in real time, but articulate it to the person that he's talking to in a motivated way that's really hard to write. It typically can come off as sanctimonious, can come off as bombastic, and what they've written is somebody who's actually deeply invested in the world that he occupies. UBA at this moment in his life is his entire world. And he has got a tremendous amount of brain power and motivation to navigate it. So we get to see an expert in an expert situation. And since I am not, the way I go about manifesting that expertise is just repetitive, grinding, hard, like pull your hair out work. And then on the day, try to do my high wire act with such an incredible cast and crew. It's kind of hard to talk about the second season without mentioning the enormous effort that the crew put in trying to operate under COVID in 2020. I suppose when we started, yeah, is that right? What year are we in now?
I know we're in 2022. I think you started filming.
We started October of 2020, exactly.
And then you paused for a bit, right?
That's right. We paused for a bit. I think of our camera operator and our focus puller, Bela and Gunnar, in these, like, the N95 masks, carrying a 60-pound, Steadicam on these long, incredibly ornate design shots that Mimi had, created. The work without a mask it's incredible when it works. So for the entire crew to operate under this kind of pressure and these obstacles, it was miraculous. And I confess, as somebody who was here in New York when it started, and like so many other people in the world, it was unnerved by the way in which we had to go about the minutia of our lives. To be at work was such a welcome reprieve. To be able to be with like the other creative collaborators working on the show, it was incredibly. There was great good fortune there, and the people who are the ones who did the heavy lifting was the crew. So I just wanted to say that.
I really love that. And I also love that you're bringing up, what it takes for the camera department to establish those shots, because Mimi's directing on the show is really astonishing, and visually the way that she's telling the story. And I'm interested in how that impacts you and the way that you're filming scenes, because you take all these scenes throughout the show and they don't end where they typically would. You're not ending and then cutting to the next moment and moving to another room. We're following the story into the next room, into the next character. And so how does that influence the way that you're working on a lot of these scenes where
pressure?
Because sometimes as well, you're existing in the ecosystem of the background, you're coming into the foreground, and then your character's still existing in another space while the scene's still continuing.
Well, it's a great point. What she has created for the audience is a living, breathing network. And so you have an awareness as a viewer that there's a whole other world happening at the same time, and the camera could shift at any point. And there will be something of interest happening with another character just adjacent to the one that you're watching there. That it is kind of one of the miracles of what they've done with the morning show. And the people who are the backbone of that are the camera and sound department. We've got incredible design, obviously, across the board, and there's no shortage in any single department for support with the morning show. But the actual functioning mechanism of making it during COVID, this was pre-vaccine as well, was Herculean by the people who were on set trying to manage these very complicated moves and coordinating them with such dexterity while having these incredible obstacles. For the cast as well, there's a different kind of pressure, which is one of the things that we attempt as actors typically is to hide our self-consciousness. Because because it's not really interesting to see an actor be terribly self-conscious. You want to watch the character work. And working under COVID protocols meant that you needed to be incredibly self-conscious about where your hands are, about how close you are to people who are not in the same screening zone, about well, every single feature of it. Like, so I guess what I drifted off there for a second, remembering being there without a mask, going through a monologue, and there's a camera, and then an army of masked people sweating their way through something, none of which you can see. And so the seeing the face of the pandemic sort of behind you, and pretending as though it is not a feature of your life as well, was one of the feats, I think, for the entire cast. I thought there was some comfort that came from when the actual storyline began to introduce COVID, because the characters then felt the same level of responsibility that we had felt maybe a year before or 6 months before. But it was one of the memorable features of making this year.
And when it comes to playing Cory as a character, there's this great duality in the fact that a lot of his emotions and his responses to things live on the surface. You know, he's not someone who's shy to say something out loud that everybody's thinking or even not thinking in the room. And at the same time, from everything that you were saying earlier, there is this whole other side of him that's very suppressed. And there's times where, you know, he seems like someone who knows when he needs to hold things back and keep them inside. And, you know, the episode where Steve Carell's character Mitch has passed away, and they're trying to confirm whether his death has happened or not, and all of the details of that is a great example. You know, he really doesn't allow any expression, and actually that's a very kind of quiet and still episode for you, to the point where you have Chip vomiting in front of him and Cory's just continuing business as usual, but then equally he can turn around and, you know, deliver those monologues that you were talking about. And so how do you kind of enjoy playing to that duality of everything that's just bubbling out over the surface, but then finding the aspects that are more restrained and internalized with him?
Well, first of all, thinking of Mark's brilliant choice, and I remember him presenting it on the day. That was phenomenal to watch and be a part of. And Mark has had no shortage of incredible choices, and the way that he executes his performance as Chip is just masterful. And it's worth noting that he brings to the table things like that are so surprising and work so well in the narrative, and then executes them with the dexterity that he does. I suppose for me, when Cory's quiet, when he's still, that's an exciting time for me playing him, because my imagination is running wild, and what Cory feels very capable of, what the writers have given him the sort of agency to put on display, is this social calculus, this ability to watch people in real time and see which way they're leaning on any one issue, and guide them towards the response that he's looking for. So when things are beginning to become unmanageable and untenable at UBA, it's a great time that I'm creatively extremely excited and exhilarated by playing. So those moments of stillness and the moments, they start in the very first scene of the first season. You know, they may have been truncated some in the cut, but it was really all about him listening to Alex on the phone the first time. The first scene where he's trying to figure out whether or not she can manage the transition post Mitch on the day that it's happening, and he's new to the job, and they've maintained that way of being, that characteristic of him throughout, despite the circumstances around him changing dramatically. So I suppose the answer is, I guess I like those more than I like the monologues. It's so much fun to be present in the moment as, you know, the person in the position of power, than to try and keep up with him and the way that he verbally attacks the world.
Well, I think that duality and all those different layers that you bring into the performance is what makes it such a joy to watch you on the show. So thank you so much for talking all about this. Really appreciate it, Billy.
Thank you so much for giving me the time. I appreciate it.